Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. And welcome to the ANZAC Memorial here in Sydney for the first and only Veterans Affairs debate during the 2019 federal election campaign. My name is James Brown, I'm the President of RSL New South Wales, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. This, as best we can tell, is the first time in a long time that we've had an engagement between the spokespeople for the major parties on Veterans Affairs during a campaign, and this is absolutely what the RSL should be doing. We're very grateful to both Amanda Rishworth and Darren Chester for making themselves available today during a hectic campaign where they've been crisscrossing their own seats but also the country. The way today's format will work is we will lead off with an opening statement by each of the candidates for the position of Veterans Affairs Minister. By coin toss, Amanda Rishworth will give the first statement and then Darren will give the second. We will then have a question from each of the candidates to their opponent, and I will then ask one or two general questions before we open it up to audience questions. Now, we tried a trial run of this the other day to see how long it would take us to get through questions. I think in an hour we managed to get through 1.5 questions. So to keep things moving, we're going to ask people who have a question for our representatives from the major parties to submit it by a card, hand it to James Wagner, who you should all have met by now. He's in the front. And he will hand it up to me so that I can ask them of each of our speakers. Veterans Affairs is one of the most complex legislative portfolios full of highly technical issues. So because of that, we'll ask each of you to only spend 2 minutes answering the questions, not a lot of time, but hopefully you'll be able to get your point across. I think it's worth recognising that the only reason we're having an election, a peaceful and secure election this weekend, is because the service and sacrifice of those who have served in the Australian Defence Force, but also the families, supporters and carers who stood behind them during their service and stand behind them afterwards. The role of RSL New South Wales is to make sure that veterans and their families are respected, supported and remembered. And of course we rely enormously on the Department of Veterans Affairs to achieve that outcome. The next federal government will be responsible for spending nearly $12 billion annually on veterans and their families, as well of course as providing an enormous leadership role in the way this country commemorates and respects its veterans, and the way the ex-service organisation community is engaged with. And I just want to acknowledge a few of the leaders of the ex-service community we have with us today, including representatives from ANZAC, from other state RSLs, from the War Widows Guild and from the TPI Association as well. There are an enormous number of veteran candidates in this election on all major parties, and of course nearly 500,000 veterans across Australia who will be forming their vote when they go to the ballot box on Saturday. So with that in mind, if I could ask you all to welcome both Darren Chester and Amanda Rishworth, and I'll call them to give their opening statements.
Excellent. Oh, do I need to turn? Oh, all good to go. Great. Well, thank you so much for having me here today, and it's like to acknowledge the RSL New South Wales for putting on this important discussion. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet and pay my respect to elders past and present. I'd like to acknowledge Minister Darren Chester. This is probably less adversarial than some of the other debates in this campaign, but also acknowledge the President of the New South Wales RSL, James Brown, but all the other RSL representatives here today and all the other ex-service organisations and those representing families here today as well. I'd like to start by thanking everyone for the role that you play, not just for the role that you've played in serving our country or supporting someone that had served our country, but also, of course, for your ongoing advocacy and your desire to actually make sure that veterans and their families' voice is heard. And for many of you, I've been working with you over the last 3 years, and I've really appreciated all the frank and fearless advice that you have given me. Working in this portfolio has only deepened my resolve to ensure that both our current and ex-serving personnel and their loved ones receive both the acknowledgement they deserve and world-class support. Together over the last 3 years, I've used the advice of people in this room to help develop 22 policies that Labor is putting forward at this election for our current serving members, veterans and their loved ones. These policies will provide greater support for our ADF personnel during service and as they transition to civilian life and through to life after service. Our policies seek to do a number of things, including improve conditions for our ADF personnel, improve the experience of transition for those leaving the ADF, expand research and deliver best practice models to support our veterans and their families, go some way to restoring equity for our veterans, ensure that communities can continue to recognise our servicemen and women and of their sacrifice and service, and engage and support families. Importantly, Labor has announced we are committed to retaining the Department of Veterans Affairs as a standalone entity. While Labor has made this commitment to a standalone department, we certainly do not subscribe to the view that reform is unnecessary. As I've said on many occasions, we do need to see a department that is less adversarial and one which is viewed by veterans as being on their side to support them during difficult times. We know that serving as a member of the Australian Defence Force does involve service, risk and sacrifice. For all veterans, it's important that they feel this service continues to be valued after their time in defence. However, over the past 3 years, veterans have made it clear to me that this is not always the case. And even with the best intentions, actions taken by government and their agencies, it has not always resulted in veterans feeling their service and sacrifice is valued once they leave defence. That's why the policies that Labor has put together really tries to address this issue and continue to let those that have served know that we value their sacrifice and continue to ensure that we assist those that are leaving the ADF. Importantly, Labor has recognised the critical role that family members for our both current and ex-serving defence personnel play. Now, I recognise there have been an increase in services for families, but for too long the role of family members has been viewed as quite separate from those that have served. And in many ways, the family, of course, serves alongside our veteran or our Defence Force personnel. They are at the front line of supporting our current and ex-serving men and women, and they need to be supported too. We want to make sure that families' views and needs are better integrated into the policies of both the Department of Defence and the Department of Veterans Affairs through a comprehensive national family support strategy as recommended by the National Mental Health Commission. Fundamentally, Labor's policies are founded on a desire to address areas in which there are gaps or inequities in the current arrangements. Veterans have told me while recognition and acknowledgement is important, they don't believe it should be tokenistic or of low value. Equally, we should not expect the private sector to be solely responsible in delivering tangible outcomes to our veterans, especially in the areas such as veterans' employment. That's why Labor has developed a comprehensive employment policy designed for government to invest and support both veterans and civilian employers to improve the outcomes for veterans. We believe both government and businesses have a role in addressing this issue of veterans' unemployment, and we've put $121 million on the table to do our part. Now, in addition to delivering additional support for employment, veterans have also raised with me, and this is particularly the older generation, about inequities in the current entitlement system. Last month, I met a TPI veteran who had taken out funeral insurance to ensure that his family was not left out of pocket because of the amount paid by a DVA would not cover the cost of his funeral. This inequity, based on when and how you served, has been an issue for our older cohort of veterans for some time. Fundamentally does not signal to those veterans that we respect their sacrifice. That's why Labor has announced that we will end this inequity, ensuring that those covered under the VEA will receive an additional $10,000 and the peace of mind that their families won't be left out of pocket to cover their funeral expenses. I've described just 3 of our 22 policies, as we only have 5 minutes, which represents a $267 million extra amount of investment for our current and ex-serving defence personnel and their families. And there has been a policy document circulated that you can read the further policies. Our policies have tried to be proactive, comprehensive and addressing gaps that you in this room have raised. In conclusion, just thank you for all the support, advice and forthright nature you've engaged with me, and I appreciate any questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Amanda, and in the same spirit, I guess, thank you to you for your very constructive approach to your shadow portfolio responsibilities in Veterans Affairs. To you, James, thank you as well for organising today, and to the New South Wales RSL and everyone in attendance, thank you for taking the time to be here. I do greatly appreciate, as I'm sure Amanda's just alluded to, I do greatly appreciate the relationship we've been able to form over the past 15 months, where the feedback that's been provided to me has been often quite forthright and often blunt even, I'd say, Amanda, but it is actually constructive. It's always about what's in the best interest of our veteran community. And I think a strong RSL, a strong ex-service community is very important for our veterans, but also very important for the Minister of the Day, so they know they're getting good, forthright advice which represents the voice of the veteran community. So thank you for that, James, and your team. Can also say to those who've served, or those still serving, thank you for your service. Thank you for being prepared to put on the uniform and potentially place yourself in harm's way to help those who can't necessarily help themselves. It's an important thing that we recognise more than just on ANZAC Day or on Remembrance Day. My focus since taking over this role last March was to work with you to deliver results. I was determined to make sure that the DVA, the government, was putting veterans first, but also putting veterans' families first as well, recognising the very important support role that the families provide for our serving personnel, both while they're serving and after their service is completed. And I'd have to say, I'd heard the DVA horror stories myself. As a local member of Parliament for 11 years, I'd had DVA clients come to me and we hadn't necessarily got the results we wanted in the timeframes we wanted them. But to be fair to DVA, I have to say now, 15 months later, that I see significant progress. I see improvements. I see the transformation which is underway, which is largely has come at a significant cost to the government in terms of the digitisation of records and the streamlining of their activities. I do see progress. I fully accept there's more that needs to be done, but I do see progress. I think we're very well served by the Secretary, Liz Cosson, someone who's a 30-year veteran herself and has worked in the public service now for 10 years. I believe she is uniquely placed to drive the transformation that DVA needs to make sure that this organisation is match fit for the next 50 or 100 years. But when I say there's more that needs to be done, it can't all come from government. And I think Amanda and I probably agree on this point. We need to see, as much as possible, corporate and community Australia and the ex-service community working in partnership with government to deliver the best possible results for our veteran community. The Australian taxpayers provide more than $11 billion per year to support about 280,000 veterans and their families. That's an increase on $300 million from the last financial year, and it is a significant number and a significant commitment. But we need to make sure that we're using that funding to also leverage community support in a more broader sense. My focus, if this government is re-elected on Saturday, my focus as your minister would be to continue the transformation process, to continue working with DVA to make sure the transformation is bedded down well, and to make sure that DVA is responding better to the needs of our younger veterans and their families in particular. Another one of my focuses will be around mental health. I think we've made some significant progress in that regard, but mental health and mental wellbeing is an area where I deliberately will need to see more community and ex-service organisation participation and practical action if we're going to reduce this horrific rate of self-harm and suicide in our community. As a first order of business in the next Veterans Ministers Round Table, which I'll conduct within the first month if we're re-elected, would be to bring the state ministers together, and the number one priority will be veteran suicide. What can we do more than we're already doing in terms of working in partnership, using the research and information we have at our disposal? What else can we be doing more in a collegiate way at state and federal level to reduce the number of veteran suicides? We provide already $200 million per year directed at veterans' mental health. We have non-liability health care, free mental health care for all veterans and their families. But what else can we be doing? The third item that I want to focus on, if I'm fortunate enough to continue in this role, is the transition. I would suggest that we have got it better. We've got it working better, but there's in the order of 5,500 to 6,000 Australian Defence Force personnel leave service each year. What else can we be doing to make sure that transition occurs well, that the employment outcomes meet their expectations, and that we are selling the message better within corporate Australia that hiring a veteran is good for your business? The veterans have the work ethic, they have the teamwork, they have the leadership skills, they're patriotic, they know how to get a job done. We need to make sure that corporate Australia sees the opportunity in hiring our veterans. I'll also continue to work in the area of respect and recognition. While I freely acknowledge that making sure our current serving members and our living veterans need all the support we can provide, the respect and recognition activity and the commemorative activities which occur are about telling the stories so that the modern generation understands the nature of service and sacrifice. It's about telling the stories also of our younger serving members, not just those who served in World War I and World War II. So the Veterans Covenant, the lapel pin, the Veterans Card, the work we've done in that regard will continue. And I'll say in relation to the Australian War Memorial, which I know is a topic of great discussion from time to time, that $498 million which will be spent on the War Memorial, the redevelopment of the War Memorial, is a large amount of money. It didn't come out of the DVA budget, and at the same time that we'll spend $498 million on the Australian War Memorial redevelopment, we'll spend over $100 billion on our veterans throughout our community. So while I know the AWM has copped a bit of flack for the redevelopment proposal, telling the story of younger veterans I think is very important in that environment. We'll also be doing some major work around the World War II 75th anniversary commemorative activities and the digitisation of all service records from World War II. The final point I want to make in terms of my priorities, I want to see great engagement and continued engagement with the ex-service organisations to maximise that community and corporate support. As a minister, or a man who is the incoming minister, whoever is the minister, they need a strong ex-service community, they need a strong RSL, and we haven't always been tidy in that regard. I think we need to get better across our ex-service community at providing a strong and united voice on key issues to the government of the day, and I want to work with the ex-service community to make sure that happens. So let me conclude where I started. Thank you. Thank you for your attendance here today, and thank you for the support you've shown to me over the past 15 months. Whatever happens, whether I'm a backbencher or a minister after next Saturday, I can assure you that I'll continue to work in a collaborative way with the veteran community.
Thank you very much. We've now got an opportunity for each of our speakers to ask a question of their opposite number. And although this is an area in which we see an enormous degree of bipartisan support and cooperation and collaboration between political opponents, the policies this year are slightly different. So I'll ask Darren to ask a question of Amanda first, and then Amanda to ask a question of Darren afterwards.
Okay, now everyone, let's get the work this far away from the picture. Amanda, if Labor wins on Saturday, will you be the Minister for Veterans Affairs?
Look, that's a very good question. I hope that I will be. Certainly, after I've engaged so much, I certainly do hope that I get the gig. It is up to the leader of the opposition, the Prime Minister of the day, to pick that, but I certainly do hope that I keep this portfolio.
Well, we've got another minute there. I've asked my leader if I can continue in the role. Did you ask your leader?
Sure, we actually haven't been discussing anything after the election, to be honest. We've put together a range of policies that I've personally been very invested in, but I don't like to jinx elections by talking about specific prizes after the election.
Would you like me to ring Bill for you?
Feel free.
Thanks, Amanda.
Well, mine's a little bit more difficult, maybe. But look, in the budget in April, Minister, $171.6 million was cut from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Given in March we received information from Senate estimates that there were veterans waiting for a significant amount of time not having a resolution to their claims, 558 days under DIRCA, 547 days under the VA and 504 days under the MERCA. Is this the right time to be reducing the number of staff in the Department of Veterans Affairs?
It's a good question, Amanda, and it allows me the opportunity to explain a little bit about the budget process, which I'm sure you're very familiar with, but some of you may not be completely across the whole detail. The federal budget this year, so the current financial year, allocated more of $11.2 billion for DVA. DVA, under its legislation, sometimes spends more than it's allocated because it has to. If it's, we're required under legislation, someone's eligible to make sure they receive that payment or that benefit or whatever the treatment might be. Sometimes it might be less. The forecast for next financial year is $11.5 billion, so an increase of about $300 million. The point I'm trying to make there is, even though there's a reducing number of perhaps some of our older veterans, the more complex needs that some veterans are living longer with requires a greater spend per individual client than perhaps we've seen in the past. In fact, we've seen an increase, I think it's in the order of 17% since 2013. So an increase of 17% since 2013 of individual gold card holders, the cost per individual client to the government. So I think it's a bit mischievous to look at the large number, the overall number, and say, I've been a cut. The Minister and the Secretary of the Department work together on how we deliver those services in the most efficient, cost-effective way to our client base, so our veterans and their dependents. There has been no cut in terms of the actual services available to our veterans, but the other point you made, Amanda, is a very valid point in relation to the waiting times. And as a minister, I have been very concerned about individual cases which go into tens of days, if not hundreds of days. And that is, I think, been a problem in DVA amongst some delegates. Some people in DVA with complex cases push them to one side to focus on the ones that can get through quicker to meet their targets. That can't happen. That's just not, we can't be doing that to our veterans. And people are waiting way too long. That then exacerbates some of the issues which we've dealt with in terms of mental health concerns. So it's a fair question, but I would have to reassure veterans that the total DVA budget increases by $300 million in the next financial year.
I'll ask two short general questions and then open up for questions. We've had quite a few of them from people here and also submitted externally. And just a reminder, we are streaming this on Facebook Live through the RSL NSW Facebook page, and we'll have a video copy of this available after the debate too. In the audience today is Karen Bird, the mother of Jessie Bird, and I want to acknowledge her extraordinary work as an advocate on behalf of veterans. The issue of veteran suicide is one that is front and centre. I'm grateful for the fact that the government has made a commitment to help train more members of the ex-service community to recognise the signs and symptoms of veterans who are in trouble and need help. And if I've read your policy correctly, you've backed in that commitment as well. So it's now effectively a bipartisan commitment for this election. What more would you be looking to do to address this issue if elected?
Well, thanks, James, and I acknowledge Karen as well, who's been extraordinary in her advocacy on behalf, not just of her own family's terrible situation, but the veteran community more broadly, and has had many occasions to meet with myself or his Costing Secretary. I touched on briefly in my opening comments in relation to the VMRT, the Veterans Ministers Roundtable, which I will undertake if I'm successful at this election and we continue in government to have the issue of suicide prevention as the number one item on the next roundtable meeting. And the reason I say that is we need to bring together the different organisations which have some level of responsibility as well. We need to bring together the research that's already been undertaken. There's a lot of research being done and bring it all together and say, well, what are the other practical steps that we can do as ministers or that you can do as an ex-service community or a defence force to prevent suicide? Suicide, from my experience, almost always there's a very complex set of circumstances surrounding the individual. And I've asked the department, and it's happened over the last 10 months, that every time there's a reported case of veteran suicide, to give me a report straight away in the first 24 hours. Are there things we can learn from this case straight away that we can implement? And that's been happening for at least 10 months. Any future minister would have that same opportunity from DVA. But then also, what other steps can we be taking in partnership with the communities where the veteran was living at the time? And one of our problems is that some of our veterans are going out of the ADF, going back to their community, and are not known to their RSL or soldier on or mates. They're simply not known to them. And so that, to me, is a real issue for us. We've got to find ways to break that nexus. So the government has put $200 million in extra funding into veterans' mental health. Open Arms has received additional funding. As you were, $4 million for mental health first aid has happened. Last week, I announced for the first time the DVA will provide financial assistance for the purchase of dogs for those with PTSD on the advice of a legal specialist, the first time it's ever occurred. And that's because veterans are coming to me saying, this dog has changed my life, saved my life. The health experts say, we haven't need evidence yet. Well, I'm acting without necessarily having the full scientific basis to go on it. But the instinct that I've got from, I've received from the veterans is, we don't know how it works. If you're telling me this dog has saved your life, we're going to find a way to get more dogs out there as well. So be innovative, try to find new solutions, but work with people who have been directly impacted to try to find what practical solutions we can bring on.
Well, thanks, and thanks, Karen. Also, we've had a lot of engagement and appreciate your advocacy and also recognise your loss as well. And for anyone else that have experienced those suicide, it is an awful, awful circumstance. I think it's really important to recognise, and as Darren has said, it is a very complex issue. And as a previous psychologist, I'm the first one to recognise it's not always more clinical services that actually support veterans or prevent suicide. It's actually a constellation of factors. So it is about ensuring that veterans have financial support, that they've got peer support, that they do have the appropriate clinical services, and it is in their community. And one of the things that Labor has announced, and very pleased the government has also supported a number of these, is actually veterans centres in community, drawing together different expertise, whether that be ex-service organisations, clinical services, but also potentially government, DVA representatives, all in community to work with veterans in a very visible way. So one of the examples that has been working quite well and is taking off is in the Jamie Larkham Centre in South Australia. Not only is there the inpatient ward, but there's also a wellbeing centre that is drawing together, creating a kind of one-stop shop. So I think it's important to recognise all those elements. The other point that I made in my speech is families have been identified by the Mental Health Commission as a protective factor against suicide. So often the first port of call or notice something's going wrong, but also a very, very important factor. So it's important we look at innovative ways to actually support families, ask for help. A lot of families I speak to have said that they kind of knew something was up, but they actually didn't know who to go to or what to do in that circumstance. So I think engaging the families and the wider community is really important. I mentioned the peer support as well, and that's where I think ex-service organisations play a really important role. Peer support, walking alongside someone that has had that experience is really important. We don't have to reinvent the wheel though. In the broader mental health space, there are some really important programs like the FAMS program, which is someone with a lived experience walks alongside someone that is having difficulties. And I think there's a lot of learnings we can use from the broader mental health sector and the broader suicide prevention sector that can do a lot as well. So I guess my message is, if I was Minister, I would want to make sure that we were not just thinking in the sort of old way of just more clinical services with health. Of course that's critically important, but we've got to look at all those contributing factors and make sure we're addressing them.
A second question to both of you, starting with Darren and Darren, relates to the TPI issue. So we've got more than 20,000 Australians who are totally and permanently incapacitated as a result of their service. The TPI Federation are running a campaign at the moment drawing attention to the fact that those veterans are only receiving 63% of the minimum wage as compensation despite not being able to work. My question, also a question echoed by Pat McCabe, the head of the TPI Federation, is will you commit to acting on the results of the now successive TPI compensation reviews if elected?
Well, look, thanks for that question. And I haven't seen the more recent reviews. Being in opposition, I'm aware that a KPMG report was commissioned by the then Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, and then a subsequent request was to re-look at that KPMG report. As a member of the opposition, I haven't seen those particular results. It did come to my attention very recently that the Prime Minister did request that his department, so not KPMG, not the Department of Veterans Affairs, but indeed the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, have a look at this issue. And what Labor said is we will continue that process if we're elected to make sure that it is properly looked at. I would expect that any inquiry would be something that government would act on, especially if it came from PM&C. But of course, what we don't want to do is take entitlements away, which is, and like I said, I haven't seen the KPMG report. I'm not sure if that's what it proposed. There have been some proposals in the past that have floated around that actually talked about taxing elements of it. I certainly would not subscribe to that. So what we've said is we will continue the process that's been started as part of, through the PM&C process. I'm aware that that is underway at the moment, and of course look at the results. So, yeah.
Thanks, James, and thank you, Pat, for the work you do on behalf of 27,500 TPI veterans. And when I said my opening comments, there's more to be done. I think the TPI issue fits, unfortunately for the incoming minister, whether it's myself or Amanda or anyone else, into the more to be done pile at the moment. There's a lot of work has been done. And your group has advocated very strongly on behalf of its members. And I know you've met with the Prime Minister and you've met with me many times in the past 12 months and you haven't got the result you're looking for at this point. I think the decision by the Prime Minister to get his Department Secretary to take a thorough look at it and make some recommendations back to the government is a good decision, and one that the incoming government will benefit from in terms of having that knowledge put in front of them. The one change which has occurred in terms of the coalition policy, and one that you advocate for, is in relation to the allied health treatment cycle. The government has decided to exclude the TPI veterans from that requirement of every 12 visits having to return to a GP, and that was largely the basis of the advocacy by the TPI Association, making the point that people with very fixed or set health injuries weren't necessarily changed in 12 visits to an allied health provider. The other point I would make, and it's one that I've had this conversation with in many roundtables across Australia, is around this requirement that TPIs can only work up to 8 hours per week. I think the DVA, government more broadly, needs to look at that. I think there are people in receipt of a TPI who would like to work longer than that, some weeks, maybe not every week, and they shouldn't be penalised as a result. I know a lot of TPIs are doing some community volunteer work in excess of 8 hours per week, and they'd be very keen to actually work a little bit longer but still maintain their TPI status. And I think that's something that the incoming government needs to look at as well.
Okay, we're now into the speed round, where we've got a range of questions to get through in a limited amount of time. Some of these are quite technical, so you may not be able to answer them immediately, but perhaps if you can characterise how you would seek to address that issue. Starting with Darren and Amanda, on the issue of the treatment cycle. So from the 1st of July 2019, veterans receiving treatment for specific conditions other than the ones you just identified will be required to go back to their doctor for another referral after 12 visits. Our colleagues from RSL West Australia have asked whether the exemptions that have been flagged by the Prime Minister can be extended. And they've pointed out the specific example that veterans who are suffering from multiple conditions, seeing multiple practitioners, needing to go sometimes on a weekly basis, needing to go back and seek referrals after 12 visits might mean that they're constantly around their doctor's office trying to address the situation. So is it possible to consider extending the non-requirement to do that?
James, it's a good question, it's a fair question, it's one that's come up in multiple round tables as I've travelled around Australia. And the important thing I want to make, the important point I want to make in relation to the treatment cycle, it's not intended to in any way ration a veteran's access to allied health. It's about saying that after 12 visits, are you getting the most benefit from that treatment? How do you assess that? You go back to your general GP, your general practitioner, and get a whole assessment. The problem with the theory is in regional and remote locations, it's sometimes difficult to access a GP that regularly. And if you've got a fixed condition, well, what's going to change in those 12 visits anyway? So that's the thing about the TPI exception. I'm open to further conversations and discussions around it because I've raised very similar concerns with DVA over these past 12 months as it approached the deadline. But I do want to make that point really clear. It's not about rationing your access to allied health services. If you've been given a recommendation to have that treatment, go ahead and have that treatment. The requirement you go back and see the GP is about taking a more holistic approach, saying, well, is that exercise physiology class working for you, or are there other things that the GP can recommend that may do greater benefit? So it's very much about making sure we're acting in the best interest of the veteran themselves and that the allied health treatment they're receiving is making a difference to their overall well-being.
Well, thanks. Look, from an opposition's perspective, we've been very concerned about this, and we did ask a number of questions and estimates, particularly around the $40 million save, which we did get the answer back that that save was as a result of less services to veterans. So we've been concerned about this. In terms of the advice from government, obviously the advice from government has been, well, we need to make sure that people are getting the appropriate treatment, and I recognise that. But at the same time, I note that the exemption has only been for exercise physiologists and also physiotherapists, and the occupational therapists have raised this as an issue as well. So look, if I was Minister, I'd want to have a conversation quickly about the impact of this, what the rationale was, because I haven't seen all the advice given to government about what the rationale was for this, except there was some conversation about over-servicing and some conversation about appropriate treatment. So I'd want to sit down if I was Minister and have a good look at where these services were being, where this money was being saved, what type of services they were, and how we can move forward with that.
Amanda, a question to you from, and then Darren afterwards, from our colleagues in RSL Victoria, relating to the eligibility for home care for partners of veterans after their partner deceases. And I'll just provide an example. Contextually, in South Australia at the moment, there's a waiting period for at least 1 year for home care packages. A 95-year-old Navy veteran living at home holds a gold card due to operational service in World War II, and his only accepted condition is hearing loss. He fell and suffered a spinal fracture of the femur. He's recovered sufficiently to go home, but is still quite fragile. He's currently receiving a home care package in addition to personal care service, weekly house cleaning, including changing and washing his bed linen. If he passes away, his wife will not be awarded. His wife is in her late 80s and has been a veteran's carer. She's becoming quite frail with a number of conditions that need to be managed. Is she now expected to put her name down for a general home care package and wait a year, or will she be able to continue to access a home care package through DVA like her access to the service pension? Quite a specific question, but I think it goes to the issue of how we look after carers, predominantly wives, after the veteran passes on.
Look, thank you, and look, I can't answer that specific question in terms of exactly how it would work, but I have heard from many carers a number of concerns about going into the My Aged Care system, and I do recognise that there is a significant wait for home care packages, but also the frustration around having cared for a long time and not really being recognised for that. So look, I'm happy to have a conversation. One thing I don't think we should accept generally as a country is that people should be in the aged care system be waiting so long for a home care package. In general, I think the blowout in terms of waiting times is very, very concerning. I think, and I'll leave that to my Shadow Minister for aged care to address in more detail, but I'd be happy to look at those circumstances. There are different ways that potentially people have spoken to me about flagging, whether that they are living carers or perhaps those that don't get classified as war widows but long-term carers within the broader system. Certainly one example that's been provided to me on a regular basis is getting the carers payment or carers pension within the system, through the central system, and having to go through that through the normal gateway of being reviewed every 2 years. So look, I'd be very interested in looking at how we better facilitate those that have been caring for a long time. One of the policies we have acknowledges also supporting carers through retreats, which doesn't go directly to this question, but does provide some peer support. But I'd be happy to have a look at that in government. But I think all of those areas where a carer is accessing either My Aged Care or Centrelink, we certainly should be looking at how we streamline that a little better.
Look, I largely agree with Amanda's points of view there, James. Other thing I would add is that we recognise that having people have the opportunity to remain in their own home for longer is a good outcome for their overall health and wellbeing, whether it's in the aged care sector or direct Veterans Affairs. Supporting that opportunity is proving difficult in some places where the lack of a skilled workforce, the availability of workforces to actually go in there and provide that care has been a problem around Australia, and I'm as concerned as Amanda is about the delay in getting access to a home care package. Once you've been assessed as being a beneficiary, then not being able to actually receive that package is a real problem for us. One of the things I'd say is perhaps more broadly, when individual cases like that come to the Minister, it normally is followed up directly to that individual, but one of the things I'd say more broadly is only today I'll be announcing the details of the Council for Women and Families United by Defence Service, and we'll be appointing Gary Costin as the chair of that council. That decision was made a couple of weeks ago and had a chance to announce it until today. But the point of that council is to provide this type of direct, practical policy input to the Minister of the day. So again, that feedback saying, well, how are families impacted by this service? How are families impacted by a DVA decision if the veteran passes away? And what support can we then provide either as a government or through the advocacy of the ex-service organisations? And so that, I think that council is something that will be well supported across the veteran community.
Two questions on the announcement by Labor relating to the increase of funeral benefits for those covered under the Veterans Entitlement Act from Ron O'Connor of the Veterans Federation. My apologies, Ron, I forgot to acknowledge you earlier on as one of our family of ex-service organisations. So the question is, will the Liberal Party match Labor's commitment? And for Labor, will your commitment impact on the current 6 weeks benevolent allowance?
The Coalition doesn't have any intention at this point of matching the announcement. We've got some significant doubts about the funding estimates that have been attached to it. We don't think the numbers add up, so we need to have a better look at those numbers if we return to government. But in terms of the overall position, to be fair to the room, no intention of matching that commitment at this point.
Well, I guess in response to that, our numbers have been put through the PBO costing process, which is the independent costing process. We think our numbers are very sound and we think it's the right thing to do. In terms of, we don't expect it to impact on the 6-week benevolent fund.
A question for Amanda first, from Herb Ellerbock, I hope I've got that name right, from the Australian Defence Force Retirees Association, relating to the upcoming inquiry into DFRDB commutation. Will it allow for input from the ex-service community? Will it investigate other connected issues relating to military superannuation? And should the Commonwealth Ombudsman be running the inquiry? Your
approach on the DFRDB?
Yeah, look, our approach is that we would continue with that inquiry wherever it's up to. I'm not aware of whether the terms of reference have actually been established yet, because from a position of opposition we haven't been able to get, I guess, a clear line of sight. If the terms of reference have not been established, we have said that we would include the ex-service community in terms of drafting those terms of reference. In terms of its scope, we've been clear that, as with the government, it is about computation, because there has been a lot of confusion expressed to me from the ex-service community that they weren't aware that when they did commute that money that they would have a reduction for the entirety of their life, so to speak. So we have said that it will be limited, as with the government, to computation. And in terms of the Commonwealth Ombudsman, I think they are a good, appropriate organisation to look at this. They have been, in my dealings with them, they've been a very impartial, independent and thorough organisation in terms of looking into matters such as abuse within defence. So I would have confidence that they're an appropriate body to look into this.
Thanks, James. In relation to Herb's question, I must make one early point. When we came to government in 2013, we indicated to DFRDB recipients that we'd take action for fair indexation, and we provided $1.4 billion towards that. So that has been something which has been a positive move, which most of the DFRDB recipients have accepted as being in their favour. In relation to the broader question of DFRDB and the inquiry, which is currently underway, I think the Ombudsman is the right person. I think it's a fair and impartial person as you're going to get in terms of that department taking over the role. The veteran community certainly wouldn't necessarily trust a politician to do it, and they've got to have faith in one institution. I think the Ombudsman is the right person to take on the role. The focus will be on the information that was provided to those DFRDB scheme participants at the time of their decision to commute a lump sum of money. And the reason we've taken the step to conduct the inquiry is because veterans have come to me and presented to me information they were given at the time, which is not consistent with the information that other veterans have been provided with. So they've got different documents. And my key question, I guess, and the reason I wanted to have the inquiry implemented was the information accurate in the first place? Was the veteran fully informed in a language they can understand? Was it in their best interest to make the decision they then made? So I think they're quite interesting questions that need to be looked at by the Ombudsman. In terms of the terms of reference, it's up to ex-service organisations to the ex-service organisation roundtable to develop those in partnership with the government, and there will definitely be opportunities for the veterans themselves to make submissions to the inquiry. There's a lot of information out there. Pulling it all together, I think, now is the right way to do it, and having that assessed independently by the Ombudsman, I think, is the only fair way we can resolve the issue once and for all.
Just a well-timed, very quick question from Matt Green of the War Widows Guild. What progress has been made on the Honouring Women and Families Council announced on the 14th of December? I think we've had an answer to that. And does Labor support the Council?
Oh yes, we do support the Council, and we are certainly been involved in the year-long run-up to having that first event, which was a very successful event, and I think one that everyone really appreciated. And so thank you to your work from the War Widows Guild for bringing that and taking a real leadership role. But I think it's been a really successful example of where the ex-service organisation or group of ex-service organisations have really pushed and has been a great success. So absolutely it has bipartisan support.
Question to Darren first. What's your position on franking credits for RSL sub-branches and other charities? And that's from Brian Swan of the Epping RSL. As you know, a number of our sub-branches have investments, so I think that's what that one's talking about.
Well, I'm not aware of how the franking credits applies to the sub-branches, so you're going to have to inform me about that afterwards. But the government's policy in relation to franking credits for individual recipients is very well known.
My question was really for Amanda.
Yeah.
The Labor Party policy is regarding franking credits, how that will affect the investments of every sub-branch. Our understanding is that we'll lose a lot of money.
It's a charitable institution.
Well, I'll have to follow that up, but my understanding is it just applies to individuals. Individuals that have self-managed retirement funds or direct shareholding. But look, I'm not sure whether you've got DFRDB status or, deductible recipient status, so I can follow that up for you.
Nothing else today. We are putting together one hell of a to-do list for whoever forms government.
We'll see some clarity as well for the current position by the Labor Party directly impacts on individuals, and the individuals in this room will be impacted by that franking credit decision, but how it impacts on sub-branches hasn't been brought to my attention before today, and I'll be very keen to investigate for you.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure, and I'll have to double check, that charities are exempt, but yes, charities are exempt. So if you've got charitable status, then it will be exempt.
Question from two RSL members, Bronte Pollard and Gary Mawson from the Northern Metropolitan District Council and the Ramsgate sub-branch. Identifying where veterans are post-service is critical to enabling government and ex-service organisations to deliver services. What is your commitment to ensure that service in the Australian Defence Force is included on the next census?
Look, we certainly have supported the call and indeed have made the call for the ABS to seriously consider, including the question on the census. I completely agree that understanding where our veterans are and to understand the problem that our veterans face is really important. What are the services they're presenting to, whether they be homelessness services, whether they be health services, is also very important as well, and that work needs to be done in conjunction with state governments. But in addition, one of the policies that we have spoken about is funding, the continual funding for the transition study that is currently underway. Their funding comes up in June this year, and we want to make sure that that transition population study, which follows veterans after they've left the ADF, also feeds in. So I think collecting data and collecting information is critically important from a variety of sources, but certainly in terms of the ABS, seriously asking to consider including that.
Thanks, James. Look, I think it's a terrific question, and for anyone who's been involved in business, you know well if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, and it's been an issue, I think, for the veterans community historically. I think it's a no-brainer. I think it needs to happen. I've written in more elaborate terms to the Assistant Treasurer to make it happen, but I wrote formally as the Minister for Veterans Affairs to the Assistant Treasurer who's responsible for the census to have it included as a question in the next census, and that process is ongoing over the next 12 months as the census questions are developed. I'll just take you back briefly to a little story. My first day in the job, I asked the Secretary of the Department, well, how many veterans are there in Australia? And they said, oh, we don't know. I said, that's okay. Tell me tomorrow. It's all right, just assuming that they didn't have the number in front of them. And they said, no, Minister, we don't know. And we simply don't know, because a lot of people left the Australian Defence Force historically and were not registered with DVA, the records didn't transfer, and they could go off and do the rest of their life and never come to the attention of DVA. That doesn't happen anymore. So the transfer of records and documentation, when you leave the ADF now, the 5,500 or 6,000 leave every year, those records are transferable, and DVA does know our younger modern day veterans when they transition out. And the other final point I would make, I think there's an opportunity for community here. When someone's enlisted, the first day they enlist, there should be a box there. When I retire, I allow for my information to be passed on to a registered ex-service organisation, so that Billy Brown or Mary Smith, when they move back to Gunnedah, we can ring the RSL up or Soldier on or someone else and say, they're coming to town, look out for them. And not this privacy rubbish which gets in our way now of stopping us alerting the community organisations that one of the fine young people is coming back to their town and may well benefit from some interaction with the ex-service community.
Question from Leslie Minner, the National Treasurer of the Partners of Veterans Association Australia, on veterans home care. Essentially, there seems to be an equity between home care available to veterans who fall under the Veterans Entitlement Act as opposed to those who fall under MERCA. Is that something that will be rectified in the next government?
Look, to be terribly frank on it, James, it's one of the great frustrations of the Minister of the day that you have 3 quite complex acts, and you get to the point where you'll have a veteran will come to you and an injury to one knee is treated under one act, the injury to the other knee under a different act. And the idea, I guess, of the Productivity Commission report and some of the other work we're doing with the DVA is how do we streamline the processes without disadvantaging the veteran or their families. And it is complex, and it's one of the reasons why we're having trouble getting advocates to want to stay involved in the whole system, because the level of training required, the complexity that's involved, rapidly frustrates them as well. So I think the Productivity Commission report, when it comes out at the end of June, will be of great benefit to the government of the day. And I think that is probably our opportunity to look at where we streamline, where we improve our processes to avoid the complexities, to avoid the duplication, but also to get rid of some of the frustration that people are feeling. And I mentioned the roundtable I've held over the last 6 months. One of the common themes is frustration with, I thought I was doing the right thing and it turns out I wasn't quite on the right track. Can you find a simpler way to get my claim processed? And if you've got a younger veteran in particular who may have some mental health concerns, you put those barriers in their road, it becomes a reason to not seek help at all, and that becomes a problem as well. So it's I know I haven't quite answered the question, it's a small entree, I guess, into a much more complex question about how we streamline and make our acts more veteran friendly and actually give life to this idea of putting veterans and their families first.
Well, look, I agree with Darren. I think there will be a lot of important learnings that will come and important ideas that will come from the Productivity Commission review. And as I said in my speech, while we absolutely support a standalone Department of Veterans Affairs, that's not to say there can't be some significant learnings. And one of those is around how do you get the acts working together, remove some of the inequities between the acts, allow for those to push in the same direction. A lot of people have told me that indeed sometimes the acts themselves actually work against an individual, so they actually oppose each other. So I think there is a significant work to be done, but at the same time you cannot, you need to do it in a way that doesn't leave a veteran worse off. That's going to be a really difficult part, and we saw that as we moved even from Circa to Durka. There was a lot of feedback given to me looking at where there was potentially some unintended consequences of where people might fall through the cracks with their specific examples. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. We think, for example, with the funeral benefit, that's a relatively simple one to change, but there is going to be a lot of other elements that are going to be a lot harder. And certainly I think for whoever's incoming, as Darren said, I think there's a lot of really important lessons from that that we can apply.
We're coming to the end of our allotted time, so I will close off new questions at this point. We have a few more to get through, so hopefully we'll be able to manage that. A question from Karen Bird. Neither political party is speaking in their respective policy documents to the great need in the current serving veteran community for veteran and military-specific acute and chronic beds in the health system for mental health conditions. Why is this and what can be done about it? And perhaps more broadly, which parts of the care wellbeing system do you think need to be veteran-specific and which parts can be in the general health system?
Well, thank you for that question, and I'm very lucky because I come from South Australia, and there's been a good partnership, particularly led by the previous South Australian government, to create the Jamie Larkham Centre, which is a specifically allocated beds for veterans, and the feedback that I've had from veterans using that centre has been incredibly positive and feel that they have fit-for-purpose mental health facilities. So I think that is the example where the Commonwealth doesn't necessarily run beds, but they fund services, and so it really does need to be a partnership between state governments and the Commonwealth about how we deliver that. And I think in South Australia there is a really good model. I know that, for example, the federal member Luke Gosling has come down to look and is in discussions with the state government in Darwin about how the territory government in Darwin about how that type of centre can be replicated. So I think there is an important opportunity there around mental health beds and how we make that very veteran specific. You brought a question about where you have veteran specific centres or veteran specific services and what are commonly known as generic services is a really important one. I don't think there's circumstances where we can have either one or the other, because if you're in a rural regional town and there's not enough veterans to deliver inpatient mental health services, you don't want to be excluding veterans from accessing mental health services. So I think it really does need to be, and my experience in South Australia needs to be not government dictating, but really working together with state governments, ex-service organisations and the veterans community itself to develop veterans centres and or veteran-specific services and centres. But if that's not available, then we should be doing everything we can to make sure, whether it's mental health professionals or other professionals, whether it's people providing homelessness services, that they understand from a perspective of a veteran. So that if a veteran does turn up at a generic service, at a general homelessness service, that the worker on the ground there is able to respond to veteran-specific needs. So I think we really need to be accommodating for both circumstances. One where there isn't necessarily veteran-specific services on the ground, but the service itself can still respond to a veteran, and where the community, where there is demand, where the community can put in the effort, where states are committed and the Commonwealth's committed, I think it is important we have veteran-specific services as well.
Thanks, Darren. Look, in the interest of time, I won't repeat a lot of what Amanda's had to say. I'll just pick up on the last point, I guess, around veteran literacy. When I say that, I'm talking about the health professionals themselves, at the source, when they're trained, need to have something in their curriculum which allows for greater awareness and understanding of the nature of military service. And that's something we can work in partnership with the medical fraternity on and the university sector. I think that's a real key to some of the challenges we face, where veterans don't feel like they're understood on some occasions when they visit a health professional, and then when they find someone who doesn't understand them, that poor person gets inundated with every veteran in the country because they recognise that this guy or girl knows what I'm talking about. So we need to expand, I think, that veteran literacy amongst the medical fraternity. We won't get back to a position where we're running repatriation hospitals through the DVA. We will be providing services through the health system, through state governments and local communities. But I think one of our real opportunities, Karen, something you and I have talked about in the past, is how we work better to help build overall mental well-being and resilience amongst our serving personnel and our veterans when they leave the service. How we make sure they've got a strong sense of purpose when they leave, that there's another tribe, if you like, that they get involved in, give them that mission focus that they thrive on, and not have them get in that position where they feel like they don't belong in the broader community. That sense of belonging, I think, is something that we can work a lot harder on achieving.
Some of these questions ideally would just have a yes or no answer, which I know is always dangerous. So I'll try and move through them quickly, and if you feel inclined to give a short answer, please do. From Mark Dobson at Team Rubicon, the Prime Minister has made a number of specific funding commitments to veterans organisations, particularly Team Rubicon, Soldier On, employment funding to state-based RSLs. Will Labor match those commitments?
Well, look, we've put forward $121 million to develop a range of different employment services, and one of those commitments is $30 million to work with the Industry Advisory Committee to build capacity in terms of employment, understanding about the value of employing a veteran, and also working with ex-service organisations. How that, whether that will be a competitive tender or whether that will be through department recommendations, that's something that we work out in government. But we've put significant money on the table also for a transition service that would specifically do case-by-case work with veterans as they transition. And this type of service would be available to people 5 years after leaving service, so that feeling of having the gate just slam behind them which a lot of people talk to me about, this service would be available, and how that service would run would be something, once again, in terms of governance, we would work on in government.
And funding for Rubicon?
Well, that would be part of the $30 million industry advisory committee about how we would do better around veterans' employment.
Just to clarify, the basis of that decision is we believe that we need to try some innovative approaches. We believe Rubicon has a model which is working, and that's why we've chosen them along with Solid on the RSL to do some more innovative approaches to veteran employment.
Will full pharmaceutical compensation be restored to gold card clients by your government if you're so elected?
You have to unpack that one for me again, I didn't quite follow it.
So it's from Pat McKay, the TPR Federation again. Will full pharmaceutical compensation be restored to gold card clients?
I have to take one notice, Pat. You have to help me with that.
Currently, the gold card, well, all the cards, the pharmaceutical cost for the veteran is based on the Centrelink Blue Card. You pay your $6.50, etc. So full compensation, I mean, will DBO pay for all pharmaceuticals for veterans?
I have to have a look for you, Pat. You've stumped me on that one. It's not unusual, I've got to say. I'm often stumping things with Pat, so I'll have to take one notice. Sorry, Pat.
That's not a policy that we've got and costed, but I'm happy if I was Minister to continue that conversation.
Okay, we're down to the last three questions.
No, there's no more from Pat.
Pat, you definitely won the award for those difficult questions, and lost the award for getting candidates to commit to tens or hundreds of millions of dollars of expenditure without notice. Both of your opponents will be very happy about that. From Narelle Bromhead, the Partners of Veterans Association, the period to access the Defence Home Ownership Assistance Scheme was recently extended from 2 years to 5 years after leaving the Defence Force. Could this, or should this period be longer?
Let's see how it goes. The extension, I think, was a good practical decision that came about from direct lobbying by the association, but also by Keith Payne, BC, you won't mind me saying. Keith was adamant that this was a poor public policy. A lot of younger veterans in particular, when they leave the Defence Force, may not necessarily commit to any particular town or living environment until a bit further down the track. We thought extending to 5 years was a fair way to go. Let's see how successful that is and go from there.
And we've offered support to the government on that, and told that nothing is that.
This one's from Ron Palmer at the Ramsgate sub-branch. It's probably more focused on the state level when you think about implementation, but it does go to the question of veteran-specific services. Is there scope for veterans suffering mental health or other issues to be treated as a vulnerable person if they have committed a crime? Is that something you would be prepared to explore if you were perhaps to recover as Veterans Minister?
Yeah, look, once again, looking at the data, there is no incarceration rates necessarily recorded, and so we don't understand or know how many veterans actually are in our prison system. So it has been an area that I have talked to a number of people about. It'd be something very much as with homelessness and a range of other issues I'd be very willing to explore, although every state and territory doesn't necessarily have those titles around vulnerable person. I'm assuming that's a particular category here in New South Wales, but I think we do need to look at our veterans that may be incarcerated, look at their specific issues that are affecting them, and look at how we support them.
I agree with Amanda's comments, but just make one other point is I would be very surprised if the veteran community was overrepresented in the prison population, and I make the point very deliberately because sometimes we get caught in a conversation which is quite negative about veterans, whereas I would argue that in the majority of cases military service is good for an individual, it's certainly good for the community and great for national security. Now, there's notwithstanding there's challenges, there's notwithstanding that some people are physically or mentally injured as a result, but we don't want to diminish military service in any way to suggest that you're going to end up broken necessarily or bad necessarily. So I think we need to make sure we have a positive conversation with the community as well about, if we want corporate Australia to hire veterans, we need to explain to them that these veterans have great skills. And in relation to the prison population, I think we do need to know the information, how many veterans are actually in that population, but I'd be very surprised if it was higher in the background population.
There's a question here from Michael Hartung from Veteran Sport Australia. I'll read it as he's written it, and then I'll interpret into plain speak. What do you see as the place of proactive and preventative measures such as sport for veterans recovery? As I interpret that, that would be, we put a very compelling funding proposal for Veteran Sport Australia in front of you. Why have you not availed yourself of this opportunity yet?
And your translation is? I'll make a couple of comments. In relation to this, a lot of these conversations started in Victor's Games. And Victor's Games wasn't about winning a sport, it was about winning a life. It was about giving veterans or varying abilities a chance to go and compete and to find a purpose. And sport, we know, is good for that. I'm a little bit critical of the Australian Defence Force today in the way that it does tend to segregate our serving personnel from the communities they live and work in. I live in Sale, I'm East Sale RAF base on my doorstep. The East Sale RAF personnel used to be a lot more heavily engaged in sports like Australian rules, volleyball, table tennis. They had their own teams competing in civilian populations, and I think that was good for the serving members and certainly good for our community. I'm a firm believer in sport. I think it has great capacity to teach you to win with grace, lose with dignity, understand teamwork. You know, it's be a great lesson for all our political parties, to be honest. If we got them to instill some of the virtues of sport in our political parties, we wouldn't be taking out our captains so often. But my point is, I agree with the basic principle of what you're saying in terms of veteran sport. It does give people a really strong sense of purpose, gets them out of bed in the morning, and it gives them a chance to meet up with people who are just as interested in being active, both physically and mentally. So I wouldn't say I haven't availed myself of the opportunity. I just haven't been able to convince the Finance Minister or the Treasurer yet. But I think you're on the right track.
Well, look, I absolutely saw the benefit that Invictus had for our serving men and women that had been injured, and I think it is a really important proposal. We got a little later than the government, so it was a little late in our processes to include it, but I certainly see the merit. I think there's a number of principles. I mean, I think you want to consider very carefully about how you integrate the ADF side of it, those that are currently serving, and the veteran side, and make sure that we've got a process to manage both sides in a really united way. And I think there's real opportunity to look at how you integrate it with groups like the Paralympics and other community teams. I particularly, in the proposal, like the concept of sort of the domestic competition, but of course we've really got to integrate that in other adaptive sport groups, because doing it just with veterans, I'm not sure is going to provide the necessary competitiveness and the value. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, and happy to continue those discussions, but I think we've also got to make sure that it's Australia-wide as well. I think that's a really important thing, and that everyone is connected up. So I think there's definitely some elements there, and happy to continue those conversations.
So that's amazing. Look, the last issue I touched on, and then we'll complete today's engagement, but we're about to commence a significant program of expansion to the Australian War Memorial, which has been discussed already previously. And for the first time in many decades, there's no representative of the RSL on the Australian War Memorial Council. As representative for a significant proportion of Australia's veterans and their families, it's appropriate that the RSL should have representation on that council. Is that something either of your governments could commit to if elected?
Look, I would have to take that one on notice, just because I wasn't aware of that. I was obviously, my understanding was that Ken Doolan was the representative. He's obviously stood down. I wasn't aware of where the appointments were up to from opposition, so I'm happy to take that on notice and get back to you.
Thanks, James. I think it's a fair question, but I'm not going to commit to what you want me to say, because the makeup of the War Memorial Council right now has obviously the service chief, so there's a fair representation of uniforms in that regard. We have Darren Kieran BC on there, Sharon Bound as well, so there's no shortage of people who served in uniform on the War Memorial Council, and that's appropriate. and also Glenn Chernay in terms of family representation, and Kerry Stokes as the chair. I missed a couple of names now, but that's not coming off the top of my head. My point being, there does need to be a mix of ex-serving personnel, current serving personnel, and those with a community, I guess, broader interest. And the RSL National at this point, I don't think was in a position to put forward someone that was necessarily going to get through the process that I have to go through to put forward Warm Royal Council members. As a minister, I have to get it through the cabinet, and there wasn't anyone coming forward from an RSL national position that would have, I think, ticked that box at a cabinet level. So I do agree with the sentiment that having Defence Force awareness is critical to the council, but I'm not going to sit here and say I'll reserve a spot for the RSL exclusively if there's no one necessarily fitting that fitting the criteria that we look at in terms of I think the War Royal Council actually right now is a very strong council.
Look, ladies and gentlemen, we've covered an enormous amount of ground in a little over an hour, and some quite deep technical detail as well. Importantly, I don't think either speaker today has accidentally committed to enormous amounts of expenditure, but they have committed to their ongoing support and passion for veterans if elected to government. And I think there's a lot in today that will help us understand how they would approach this portfolio if elected. In a second, I'll ask you to express your appreciation for both their willingness to grapple with these issues today, but also the work that they have done on veterans policy from either side of the aisle. But let me first thank each of you for your service to this community and for your passion and for being approachable. I think one thing both of you bring in spades is a great level of approachability, particularly to members of our community and people in this room. So let me say thank you, but to all of you, if you could please say thank you to our speakers and wish them the best of luck for the rest of the campaign.